Hi, this is Paul. Every day I scan my little Google bot for any new Jordan Peterson things, and the piece I found today from the Toronto Star is going to be a biggie. And it's going to be a biggie because this was written by a former colleague of Peterson, a friend or former friend of Peterson, and he writes it in an expose fashion. And the title is set to grab attention. I was Jordan Peterson's strongest supporter. Now I think he's dangerous. Dangerous. This is a big word. And so I want to give a few orienting thoughts on this because I know this is going to go off like a bomb in some places, and people are going to be reactive, and it's going to be a food fight. And so I'm going to give a little bit of initial advice. Take a deep breath and slow down. It's a piece, and these are people. And this is what happens with people. This is what people do. This is how we sort things out together. This is how one of the most common, and a not uncommon call is, Pastor, I think I'm going to get a divorce. Why? Did you have a fight with your wife? This is what people do. We spar, we get sideways with each other, and the higher the status stakes, the more the chumming of the water, what we do on social media, the more reactive we all get, and then we instantly get tribal and defensive, and off we go. So take a deep breath and slow down. Your initial instinct is to protect your friend or to pile on your adversary. And so if you hate Jordan Peterson, aha, vindication. And if you love Jordan Peterson, and immediately we've got the rider and the elephant, our post hoc rider. Boy, we're geared up and we can shoot plenty of verbal arrows at someone. Just hold your fire. It's just words. Take a deep breath. Have a conversation. Most of us don't know Jordan Peterson personally, so even in a moment like this, it's helpful to sit back and say, now what inside of me has really attached to him, and what has attached to him in what way, and why. And it's a good moment for introspection and say, okay, what's happening inside of me? Why do I feel reactive? Why do I want to attack? And again, it's just completely natural. And what social media does is give us a place to attack and react and go. And that's probably the best thing to not do at first. Now, one of the things that is common in our contemporary conversation is that we prioritize the personal. And we see this in the gender fights. We see this in many fights where we say, well, there's the ideas of right and wrong and ethics and morality, but the personal should have priority. That's become axiomatic in our culture. And I want to push back on that a little bit because the personal is important. And so, but the personal has to be kept in balance within the entire economy of a relationship. And so just simply automatically ceding priority to the personal is just as mindless as always defaulting to some traditional orthodoxy or new popular orthodoxy. It's better to sit back and think things through and say, okay, this is in a personal space. And of course, it's the personal angle that gives this thing power. This is someone who says, I know Jordan Peterson. I was friends with him. He lived in my home when his children were small. And even that, to our watchers, raises all the stakes because now we're dealing with betrayal. And so, okay, well, what do we do with this? First of all, a few initial takes from mine. No surprises in this for me. Every world has its value. And what are the values of the academy? The values of the academy are a certain amount of detachment. When I was talking about the Delahanty lectures, if you look at, for example, a modernist approach to knowledge, it's very much third person. We want to be emotionally distant. We want to be evaluative. And so those values in the academy are protected, and they're protected by social sanction. And one way to understand this piece is this is, in a sense, another academician complaining about someone who is, in a sense, levying his credentials from the academy out into the public space, saying, you know what, he's not being a good academic. A good academic is staid and measured, and they equivocate, they don't rush to judgment. Peterson is, in some ways, especially when he's talking off the cuff, he's all gland. And that's why this guy says he's a preacher. He wanted to buy a church, which when I read that, I thought, that doesn't surprise me a bit, given his biblical lectures. Many times, I mean, he's performed a marriage for someone. And so, you know, there are these boundaries that we have embraced in our contemporary frame. And Peterson's always been crossing these. That's what makes him interesting. So the fact that an academic would look at him and say, I'm offended by the decisions that he's made, and I think he's dangerous. Well, the boundaries within academia have been created for a reason, and those reasons are to protect the academy. They are also ways to hide. And in almost any case, a good thing has its shadow side. And so you work on that. So Peterson has violated the values of the academy. He's violated the values of secularity. He's done that by, of course, bringing the Bible back into the conversation. That is deeply troubling to a lot of people. What are the values of a community? What are the values of Toronto? Now, I don't know. I'm not from Toronto, and some of you will probably speak to that. But this is what has made Peterson so interesting. This is what drew our attention to him. You know, we have this saying, rules are made to be broken. Well, boundary lines, if transgressed, are seen. Now, there are sometimes good reasons to transgress a boundary line and bad reasons. And so every time someone transgresses one, there's going to be enforced non-transgression in the community. I don't mean state enforced. I mean, this is how communities work. We enforce things, and we enforce things with gossip. Again, read Jonathan Haidt's The Happiness Hypothesis. We enforce things with gossip. We enforce things with censure. We signal in these ways, and that this signal has come out of where it's come out of. I'm not surprised by this at all. Peterson has always wandered over into the world of religion, and again, in our secular frame, many people have a lot of fear when it comes to religion, because within our culture, religion has been in the past a very powerful force. And part of what has happened in the rise of secularity is that religion has in many ways receded, and there has been a sort of truce that was drawn up between the secular sphere and the religious sphere. And we are always implicitly watching clergy and politicians for these boundaries. And these are common things that come into the fore with American political campaigns. Donald Trump, who prior to the campaign, in my experience, showed little or no interest in religion, suddenly found his Bible, and part of me snickered when it was the Bible that his mama gave me, because he probably hasn't bought one since. And if you go to church, you recognize that people who use their Bibles often have quite a few different ones for study, and they tend to wear them out, or they take notes in them. And so people who actually practice Christianity and work their Bibles, the Bible is a tool, and like any good tool, it's worked. And so to have someone show up with the Bible their mama gave them, and you can still read it, you kind of say, yeah, well, you haven't worked that Bible at all. And of course, all of these signals are out there. And then with Barack Obama, for example, he had his church, and then his pastor was saying things, and some of you might remember in the 2008 campaign, Jeremiah Wright was a big deal in Barack Obama's campaign, and who is the potential president's preacher, and all of this stuff. So the world of religion is hot stuff. But you know, again, as I've repeated in other videos, when you pause and ask yourself, why do we call teachers in the university professors, one might want to do a little bit of history on the history of the university. And again, if you look at the Dallas Willard video that I mentioned in yesterday's YouTube, there are elements of that in there. So you have the world of religion, and Peterson has always had a religious manner about him. The academy values the specific, but the religious values the integrative. And so what Peterson does in his lecture is he's got some psychology, he's got some philosophy, he's got some mythology, he's taking from the Bible. This is what he does, and that an academician would see this and call this dangerous should be of no surprise. Now, what is surprising to many is that, well, many who don't necessarily come to church, or many for whom, their pastors are well socialized to stay within certain lines, know that, these line questions are always there, and they're there in different churches. And if you've got a lot of experience in the religious world and in terms of lots of different churches and traditions, you recognize that these questions of lines and transgressing them are common topics of conversation. What happens when the pastor suggests to a man that his wife would love him more if he made more money, or shaved, or spent more time with his appearance? Or what happens when a pastor says to a woman that maybe her marriage would be better if she'd lose weight? These are not stories I'm picking out of random. I have never told any single woman in any of my churches that she should lose weight, okay? That is not a story from me. But again, we pay attention to these lines, and our watchers pay attention to these lines. And so the fact Jordan Peterson has attention because he's a line crosser. And that's why people love him, and that's why people fear him. And the fact that someone now comes up and says, and can, in a sense, present credentials of personal relationship, and now in an article like this seem to be a betrayal, boy, this grabs our watchers, and we focus in right away. And so then the elephant is all disturbed, and then the riders start chattering, and off we go to the races. But none of this should be a surprise. For one thing, and if you remember the Jonathan Haidt interview with Peterson, Haidt mentioned, here's a Jungian. Here's a guy who's out in public, and he likes to talk about Carl Jung. Often I'll get questions in the comment section, why are Christians and Christian evangelicals so suspicious and afraid of Jung? For good reasons. Jung is a scary dude. Jung is a scary dude in a lot of the ways Peterson is a scary dude, because Jung, in many ways, tried to upset some of the boundary lines that from the Protestant Reformation and after the Reformation and into the Enlightenment, groups and societies set up and said, preachers are over here, politicians are here, the academy is here, and if we stay within these lines, we won't have fights. Well, what is Peterson doing? He's causing fights. He's causing probably fights within family. At our meetups, a regular thing for people to say is, I can't talk to my wife about this stuff, and that doesn't go well. And I completely understand why. So Peterson is transgressing these lines. And if you transgress these lines, people in the various different camps will get nervous. But again, this is common stuff. Presidents transgress these lines. Peterson made a comment about the fact that in the American system, we don't have a monarch. And the monarch carries some symbolic freight that that you don't necessarily want on the political train. And so, this is all very complicated stuff. And so then when Peterson, secularists or materialists say, oh, he's too woo-woo. He's, especially when we hear that, Peterson had this vision, and he had this vision that God told him that, he was going to fight this great monster, but, God said he would win. And then Jordan's wife has a dream, and Jordan takes his wife's dream seriously. And boy, this in the academy, that's crossing some real lines. And if you're a materialist or a rationalist, that's crossing some real lines. But if you read any Carl Jung, boy, you're going to read more about dreams than probably you ever wanted to. And reading through his autobiography, it's like, oh, another dream, blah, 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 blah. Well, that reveals my biases. And so after reading Jung, I pay a little bit more attention to my dreams. But I worked with Haitians for whom they had dreams all the times, and sometimes they would dream about me, and they would tell me some of their dreams, and some of their dreams would seem to come true. At the time I was in the Dominican Republic, I had one child, and my wife and I didn't seem to be very fertile. A doctor had told her that, and we had one child. And so this woman in the community comes up to them and said, oh, missionary, I had a dream about you. Oh, really? What was your dream? You were surrounded by fruit and flowers. I said, well, that's interesting. And she said, you're going to have many children. I thought, well, that's really interesting. And I just kind of laughed it off. And well, I got 5 kids. Was it prophetic? Was there something in the dream? Answer it any way you want to. Life is like this. Now, again, this is a story like that. The academy would approach a certain way. Religious people would approach it a certain way. The political realm would approach it a certain way. In Kuyperian talk, Abram Kuyper, this is a big guy in my tradition. You have sphere sovereignty, and it's all about these boundary lines that we kind of agree to socially, and when we stay within those lines, we don't fight. But when we transgress these lines and trespass over these lines, people get nervous, and when people get nervous, the writer starts to talk. So, is Schiff being dishonest? I don't read him as dishonest at all. I think this is his honest assessment of Peterson. And the alarm bells he's ringing are completely understandable and predictable. And in fact, there's various versions of them all over the place in a lot of the Jordan Peterson chatter, which are completely consistent with it. So to have an article like this surface, no, what's actually most interesting about this article is that this individual feels motivated enough to, in a sense, do exactly what Peterson is doing. He in some ways is breaking the code of the academy, but now breaking the code is warranted because he believes Peterson is breaking the code, and therefore it's within the academy to call Peterson to account of the rules of the academy. It's a certain game that's being played. And so I don't find this dishonest at all. I find it completely believable. And I'm sure that there are a number of other academics who feel just like this guy. And when they read this, they're going to say, finally, someone is speaking my truth. He's relating the truth as he sees it. We all see things from where we stand. Without knowing him, this critique and alarm of Peterson, of a U of T professor, doesn't surprise me a bit. Peterson caught my eye because he did transgress these lines, because he was different from what I expected from a university professor in North America. This letter is exactly what I expect from a university professor in North America. Now, in this article, Schiff mentions that he has a transgender child. And again, this doesn't surprise me. So why? Now, people say, well, that leads to bias. And that's exactly right. It does lead to bias. And what I would say is that instead of necessarily focusing on the bias of this individual, we should focus on the way we have prioritized the personal in terms of our calibration of how we should evaluate sources and judgment. So a lot of people will say, well, what if you had a child who was disabled? Or what if you had a child who was gay? Or what if you had a child who was transgender? Or what if you had a child who was incarcerated? Or what if you had a child who had a DUI? Well, yes. Would that affect me? Obviously. Well, why? Because hopefully I love my child. That is a bias all of us should have. But now, how does that bias impact my capacity to make evaluations in other spheres in which I live? For example, let's imagine there's a judge who has a DUI. Should that judge DUI cases? Now, you might say this person's judgment expressed in this case was in isolation to other places, or this person's alcoholism is now under control. A judge who has himself been pulled over by a police officer for driving while intoxicated might have some feelings, and those feelings could go either way. That judge might be too lenient on people who come before him or her in terms of driving while intoxicated. That judge could be too dramatic. And this is this entire game of rationality and disinterest. And so, again, what's interesting about the Schiff piece is that, is he biased? Well, of course he's biased. He has a child who's dealing with these issues. He's going to have opinions. Do some of those inside opinions afford a particular perspective on it? Yes. And this is where we get back into the conversation of, does an African American have a certain class of knowledge about being African American and about being black in America that a white person doesn't have? Yes, they do. They have certain experiences, and those experiences are valuable, and those experiences should be shared and come into the public conversation. Now the question is, what priority should those experiences have? And that's exactly the same kind of question you have to ask with a question like this. What priority should this have? Now, in some ways, those who jump in and say his bias with respect to transgender and what Peterson has said should disqualify him. And I would say, no, it shouldn't disqualify him, but it's a filter through which we read this. And it's helpful that he lays his cards on the table and says, this is part of my filter. Now, the same thing goes for any of my videos. Someone could say, well, he's a Christian, and so his bias is going to be Christian. Yes. He's a pastor. His bias is going to be towards the clergy. Yes. Now, does that mean you should have a very low resolution binary, listen or not listen? No. Take the bias into consideration. Weigh it. Filter it. Think about it. That's what being cognizant of biases should do. So think and discern slowly. It takes a solid personal core. It's a solid personal core to not simply react to things. Reaction is natural. Reason is hard. Discernment is hard. Now, when we feel reactivity, we should recognize that's data. Why am I reacting to this? Why am I getting excited about this? Why am I going to get on Twitter or Facebook and want to flame somebody? I've done this. We all do this. Maybe not all of us. Some of us perhaps are wiser than me and stay off completely. Some of us can't stay off. On and on and on and on. But let's take a deep breath. Often the initial thought we have is telling. It's good data, but it might not be the thing we want to live with forever. And so because of the nature of words, often you never get a second chance to make a first impression. They're pretty strong. But wisdom says, continue to evaluate, continue to think, continue to use reason. And as a religious person, continue to pray, continue to meditate, continue to ponder, continue to take in data, continue to analyze. It takes a solid personal core to not simply react to things that you don't like and not be reactive. And we all struggle with this. We have a juvenilized public sphere now that imagines people are by nature safe and nice, and that if everyone just says nice things, everything will be nice. Or we have a juvenilized public sphere that says, well, you can have a dogmatized or a too rigidly ordered public sphere that says, you're a philosopher, you may not do this. You're a pastor, you may not talk about this. Everyone should stay within the lines. And generally speaking, yes, everyone should stay within the lines. Now we have rules and exceptions, and there are places for rules and places for exceptions. The problem with always being the exception is that you now become the rule, and that's in the sense that Stephen Fry kind of becomes Loki. If your rule is God of mischief, well, that's going to be your shtick. And people are going to pretty well figure out, I'm not going to trust him on my team because he's going to be off my team in a minute, because that's what mischief does. That's chaos. Okay, take it into consideration, evaluate it. The order chaos business that I think Peterson talks well about, which is really helpful, is operative here. Peterson has been pumping a lot of chaos into the system. And if I were a fellow U of T colleague entrenched within that culture and within those systems, and if, according to this guy, I were responsible for bringing him in, and all of the other colleagues' elephants are all getting nervous and all their riders are chattering nervously, the fact that this guy finally goes big, and of course the Toronto Star is like, oh baby, this one's going to get hits. This is how the game is played. So, and yes, in the food fight, in the popular sphere, people are going to be all over this. See, I told you Jordan Peterson is a demagogue. See, I told you Jordan Peterson is a bigot. Jordan Peterson is Jordan Peterson, okay? Some of the points this guy made are good points. And, does Jordan Peterson stoke fear in me? Yeah, sometimes. Well, here's the thing about fear. Sometimes we should be afraid. Sometimes we shouldn't. You have to figure that out. And so you listen and you weigh and you evaluate and you talk and you discuss. And when you get something wrong, you retract. And when you do something wrong, you apologize. And this is how we go. So, sources and truth. Truth can be found in strange, flawed, surprising places. That pretty much equals people. Knowing the source always colors the content. It's helpful to be too it's not helpful to be too accepting or too dismissive too quickly. See, I got my slide wrong. And a book recommendation, sometimes people are asked to recommend books. I love this little book. It was a great little book. It was a great little book for moments like this where people are, ah! Or people are, ah! Those are the elephants talking. Learn how to think. Learn how to evaluate. Learn how to handle social media. Learn how to think slowly. The internet is not going away. Social media is not going away. You want to live in this world? You want to live with wisdom in this world? Find wisdom and take it. So there are some initial thoughts. Hope they're helpful. Fill up the comments. Let me know what you think.